Heaven Watkins was born on April 14th, 2007, to Latoya Monique Smith and Wen Watkins, entering the world as a fighter weighing less than 2 pounds. Doctors classified her as a micro-preemie, one of the smallest and most fragile babies they treat. She spent 3.5 months in the neonatal intensive care unit, fighting complications that included bleeding in her brain and hydrocephalus, a condition where spinal fluid fills the cavities of the brain. Both conditions pressed on her delicate brain tissue, causing irreversible damage that would result in cerebral palsy. Despite these challenges, her family on her father's side described her as a joy, with a spirit that matched her name. Her aunt, Dr. Sharonda Robinson, called her a chatty Cathy, who would talk endlessly and sing to everyone she met. Heaven had brown hair, brown eyes, and a bright smile that could fill any room. She loved smooth jazz, Hall's cough drops in pink and purple, and her aunt's cat named Porchy. She demonstrated remarkable compassion from an early age, once giving her last $5 to a homeless woman so the woman could, as Heaven put it, go get a house. After leaving the hospital, Heaven went home with her parents and older brother, later joined by 2 younger sisters born in 2010 and 2012. The family appeared ordinary from the outside, but signs of trouble would soon emerge that would ultimately lead to a tragedy no one could have imagined when that tiny baby first fought for her life in the hospital. The first official reports of trouble in Heaven's home emerged in 2012 when she was 5 years old. Latoya called 911 after Wen punched her in the mouth, and he disconnected the call by throwing the phone across the living room. He was charged with domestic violence and interfering with an emergency call, and a restraining order was issued. The very next month, Heaven's teacher noticed a bruise on her cheek, and when Heaven didn't show up at school the following day, officers performed a welfare check. They found Wen at the home in violation of the restraining order and arrested him again. Heaven was placed in state care for a short time, but eventually returned to her parents after Wen attended domestic violence counseling and the restraining order was canceled. By 2014, when Heaven was 7, the red flags had multiplied dramatically. She showed up at school with a swollen lip and said her father had hit her. Investigators discovered Wen was selling drugs from their home, and both drugs and weapons were found there. Heaven was displaying inappropriate behavior at school, talking about adult topics and having outbursts that sometimes signal trouble at home. There were allegations that an older child had touched her inappropriately, though Heaven refused to discuss what happened. Family members told CPS that Latoya treated Heaven badly, making her stand in the corner for hours. Because of her disabilities, Heaven qualified for funding to hire a personal care assistant, but Latoya's sister was listed on the paperwork and kept half the money while providing no care, giving the other half to Latoya. At school, teachers observed Heaven was still in diapers, but sometimes had to change herself because her parents wouldn't. She was severely underweight, hadn't learned to walk, lacked leg braces, and came to school in a wheelchair. Her vision was poor, but she had no glasses. She hadn't seen a doctor in over 1.5 years and had never been to a dentist. Academically, she was struggling so much that some teachers thought she had the mind of a 2- or 3-year-old, though her behavior issues made reliable assessment difficult. After substantiating several claims, Child Protective Services picked Heaven up from school and placed her into emergency foster care, determining that Latoya could not protect her from sexual abuse or meet her special needs. Scared and stressed by the experience, Heaven struggled in her first foster home. Her father asked his sister Sharonda if she would take care of her, and Sharonda, who already ran a daycare for children with special needs, quickly completed the requirements to bring Heaven to live with her. Sharonda lived only 6 houses away from the home Heaven had shared with her parents, and Heaven's grandmother, Rayola, and cousin lived nearby, becoming deeply involved in her care. In this stable and loving environment, Heaven made remarkable improvements. A month later, her siblings were also removed from Latoya's care, with her sisters joining Sharonda and her brother going to another aunt. It soon became clear that Heaven had been starved for attention rather than incapable of learning. Sharonda discovered that with patience and focus, Heaven was highly teachable. She received new leg braces, and her grandmother taught her to walk on her own, something Sharonda believed could have happened much earlier if her parents had worked with her. Sharonda caught up all her medical and dental appointments, got her glasses, and enrolled her in physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy. They taught her to use the toilet, and soon she no longer needed diapers. She gained 40 pounds and reached a healthy weight for her age. They styled her hair, bought her cute clothes and pink eyeglasses, one of her favorite colors. Her confidence grew as they taught her respect and patience, and her outbursts decreased dramatically. On a trip to the circus, Heaven asked her aunt, "Auntie, am I acting good?" Sharonda replied, "Yes, baby, you're acting good." After a year with Sharonda, Heaven exceeded all the goals of her individualized education program at school, catching up academically and winning a Best Storyteller award. All the kids and teachers knew her, and she even had a special seat in the nurse's office with her name on it, like a VIP. Despite her happiness with Sharonda, Heaven carried memories of her previous life and fears about her future. She often thanked her aunt and grandmother for taking care of her and worried they might stop. When she misbehaved, she would ask, "Are you going to stop taking good care of me?" Her aunts always assured her that mistakes were okay and nothing would make her stop providing care. But Heaven hadn't forgotten the life she lived before. Sometimes she would ask her grandmother, "You're not going to let nobody kill me. You're going to still take good care of me?" Her grandmother would answer, "I'm not going to let nobody kill you." Heaven was safe and happy with her aunt, and her family wanted to take care of her permanently. Unfortunately, Minnesota law had different priorities. Like many other states, reunification with biological parents is one of Child Protective Services' primary goals, regardless of how well a child is doing in foster care. The system wanted Heaven to live with her mother, and they were determined to make that happen. Wen and Latoya had separated when the children were taken away, and Heaven's father had moved and no longer spoke to any of his family members. In the summer of 2016, Heaven was required to start trial visits with Latoya, who was now living with a new boyfriend named Deontay Harris. At first, Heaven enjoyed these short visits because she knew she could return to Sharonda afterward. But as the visits grew longer, the tantrums and difficult behaviors she had overcome with Sharonda began to resurface. On one occasion while being dropped off, Heaven tried to choke her mother, and her grandmother had to pull her off Latoya. The stress of being forced back toward a mother who had neglected her was undoing all the progress Heaven had made, and the system took no notice of this regression as a warning sign. Sharonda witnessed several disturbing incidents that should have raised alarms for Child Protective Services. When Heaven needed help, well-meaning neighbors knew to bring her to Sharonda rather than trusting Latoya to provide care. One time they brought Heaven because she had a long cut on her foot that was still bleeding, and she was wearing only a long shirt with nothing underneath. Sharonda made sure her foot was properly treated. Another time, Heaven had been wearing the same underwear for 3 days and desperately needed a bath, so Sharonda helped her bathe. Sharonda wrote a letter to CPS, begging for just a year or 2 more so Latoya could receive more training about how to properly care for Heaven. In the letter she wrote, "I want to see Latoya with her children, but the right way, the healthy way. Not with rushing the process which causes the county to skip steps so that the children are back in an unsafe environment." On another occasion, Heaven got a hair bead stuck in her ear, and someone brought her to Sharonda, who took her to Children's Hospital for removal. While at the hospital, Heaven made statements indicating abuse, and her CPS worker met them there. Rather than investigating the statements, the worker expressed concern that Sharonda was coaching Heaven to make false reports. The worker separated them and eventually decided Heaven was just repeating things that happened when she was much younger, closing the report as unsubstantiated. Another time, Sharonda stopped by Latoya's house to visit, and Heaven begged her to take her home, asking about her grandmother and Porchy the cat. Sharonda was heartbroken because she couldn't take her, feeling she was breaking her promise to always take care of Heaven, but she was bound by CPS rules. After that, Sharonda drove by the house regularly to check on Heaven. She often saw Heaven's sisters playing outside, but she never saw Heaven outside again, which worried her deeply. When a shipment of Ensure and diapers arrived at Sharonda's house, she knew Latoya had forgotten to change the shipping address, and she understood this meant Heaven was losing weight and struggling with toileting again. These were all bad signs, but Sharonda didn't know how to help her niece from outside the system. She joined a parent leadership organization that worked with CPS, hoping she could create change from within, and she wrote letters begging them to do what was best for Heaven. Eventually, she felt it became personal, with CPS accusing her directly of making things up. She said, "I felt like it was more of them not liking me than about what was best for Heaven." For a time, she stopped calling CPS and let the schools and professionals report what they saw. But this didn't help either. When school started, teachers noticed red flags based on what Heaven said and filed a report of suspected child maltreatment, holding a meeting about concerns over her ongoing care. School officials were under the impression Heaven was going back to live with her aunt, and even sent a school bus driver to Sharonda's house to pick her up. But CPS didn't remove her. They left her with her mother. In one of her last letters, Sharonda wrote, "Somehow this whole situation has become an us against them situation, and that is a shame. We should all be on the same side as the children. Is it going to take one of the children getting hurt before something is truly done?" She also told CPS workers directly, "Heaven's not going to live long if you send her back there, and the blood's going to be on your hands." Heaven made another report of abuse to the school in October 2016, but it was again listed as unfounded. Later that month, her guardian ad litem submitted a report to the court stating Latoya had made significant improvements because she was passing drug tests and attending therapy. Crucially, none of the information from Sharonda or the school was shared with the judge. Based solely on positive reports, the judge returned Heaven to Latoya permanently. Soon after, CPS closed the case. Less than a year after Heaven was returned to her mother, Latoya and Deontay moved to his home state of Virginia, over 1,000 miles away from everyone who had ever protected Heaven. Heaven's brother refused to go and moved in with relatives in Minnesota, but Heaven and her two sisters had no choice but to move with them to Hampton Roads, Virginia. They lived with Deontay's family for several months upon arrival. In Minnesota, the funding set aside for Heaven's personal care assistant had restrictions preventing it from going to friends or family of Latoya because she had previously had her sister pretend to provide care while keeping the money. But when they moved to Virginia, Latoya signed Deontay Harris up as Heaven's PCA, meaning he would get paid for taking care of her. This financial arrangement may explain why he and Latoya wanted custody of Heaven, since otherwise they seemed to view her as a burden. Sharonda only found out about the move from a friend of her daughter who saw it posted on social media. Feeling helpless, she began Googling Latoya and Heaven's names every day. When her daughter asked why, she said, "Because she's going to be on the news." On February 26, 2018, Heaven acted up on the school bus, and as punishment, Deontay held her hand under hot water until she had third-degree burns. He deliberately chose her right hand, which was Heaven's only fully functional hand. Deontay told Latoya what he had done, but she didn't take Heaven to the hospital right away. 2 days later, Deontay's sister saw Heaven's injury and made Latoya take her to the emergency room. Deontay instructed Heaven to lie, telling her to say she had been washing her hands and the water got too hot. According to Latoya, everybody had to say that. The injury was so severe that doctors admitted Heaven, surgically repaired her hand with skin grafts, and kept her in the hospital for 6 days. Virginia Child Protective Services was notified about Heaven's severe burn injury requiring hospitalization and skin grafts. Yet they did not press charges at the time and did not remove Heaven from Latoya and Deontay's care. According to their protocols, they should have attempted to check with CPS officials in Minnesota to determine if there was any history of abuse or neglect involving Heaven or her family. When asked directly about whether they made this check, the agency refused to answer, citing privacy regulations. It remains unclear whether they ever learned that Heaven had been removed from her mother's care multiple times, that there were substantiated claims of neglect, or that Sharonda had explicitly warned that Heaven would die if returned to Latoya. 2 months after the burn incident, on April 10th, Latoya announced her engagement to Deontay on social media. At the time of this joyful announcement, she was fully aware that he had viciously harmed her daughter, holding her only functional hand under scalding water until third-degree burns required skin grafts. Still, she decided she wanted to marry him. Around the same time, the family moved into an apartment on Ballantine Boulevard in Ocean View, Virginia. On May 18th, Latoya called 911 and told dispatchers that her 11-year-old daughter was unresponsive. When firefighters and paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. Heaven was pronounced dead at the scene. Police spoke to Latoya that day, and she told them Heaven had fallen about a week before while playing tag with her sisters. She blames the fall for Heaven's death and claims that she and Deontay never hit or hurt her. After police left, she told neighbors that Heaven had died of natural causes, and several neighbors stayed and shared drinks with Latoya and Deontay while they cried for hours. When police questioned Latoya more thoroughly the next day, her story changed dramatically. She admitted she hit all her children with a belt on occasion, but she punished Heaven more because Heaven acted out constantly. She told officers that when Heaven was bad, she only fed her bread and water, and at the time of her death, Heaven had been on bread and water for 3 or 4 days. In the past, Latoya admitted, she had kept Heaven restricted to bread and water for as long as a week. Latoya described their regular punishments, which included making Heaven stand in the corner for hours, facing the wall, while Deontay would hit her and punch her on the back, arms, and legs. Other times, he hit her on the back with a hard slipper or shoe. On at least one occasion, he grabs her by the neck and punched her in the face, splitting her lip open. When asked how often Deontay hit Heaven, Latoya said, "Every time she's in trouble, maybe 3 or 4 times out of the week." She said Deontay had hit Heaven on several occasions when she had a dirty diaper because he couldn't stand the smell, which meant the man the state was paying to care for this disabled girl was beating her for the very condition he was paid to manage. Latoya also told officers she never interfered when Deontay hit Heaven, and when asked why she didn't protect her daughter, she said she didn't know. The night before Heaven's death, Latoya said Deontay had punished Heaven because she soiled her diaper while standing in the corner. Deontay punched her 3 or 4 times in the back with a closed fist, twisted her around, and punched her twice in the chest and once in the stomach. That same night, Latoya admitted she smacked Heaven in the face during her bath because she brought a toy into the tub. When officers asked Latoya what Heaven did when Deontay beat her, she said, "She cried and said stop." Medical examiner Dr. Michael Hayes later described the injuries found during autopsy. Heaven had bruises on her forehead, cheek, chin, torso, back, belly, and all 4 limbs, along with 2 black eyes. Her right upper arm had been twisted and broken. She had 23 rib fractures that, based on varied healing, occurred in at least 4 separate events, with 2 or 3 fractures happening in the days before death and 1 occurring at or near the time of death. There was hemorrhaging in her brain, in the optic nerve sheath of her eyes, and behind her abdominal wall tissue. Her small intestine had ruptured, likely several days before she died, from being struck so hard in the belly. Latoya and Deontay were both charged with second-degree murder and held without bond at the Norfolk City Jail. CPS reopened the investigation of the burned hand, charging Latoya with abuse and neglect and Deontay with abuse and malicious assault. In September 2018, prosecutors withdrew the murder charges and replaced them with felony homicide charges, which in Virginia means an accidental killing during the commission of another felony. On October 17, 2018, Latoya pled guilty to 1 count of felony homicide and 1 count of felony child abuse. On October 30, 2019, Deontay pled guilty to 1 count of felony homicide and 2 counts of felony child abuse. He was sentenced to 60 years with 35 suspended, leaving him to serve 25 years. At Latoya's sentencing hearing on October 7, 2020, she cried and said she wished she could get her daughter back. She was sentenced to 50 years with 20 suspended, leaving her to serve 30 years. Deontay is scheduled for release on March 12, 2040, from Green Rock Correctional Center. Latoya is scheduled for release on August 22, 2044, from Fluvanna Women's Correctional Center. Heaven's family held a memorial service and had her cremated. Her Virginia neighbors held a vigil in the apartment parking lot, releasing pink, purple, and white balloons with messages, lighting candles, and displaying pictures. One neighbor said, "She was our next-door neighbor. My niece came out and played with them all the time." Another said, "I can't believe somebody is that cold-hearted to do this to an 11-year-old child with cerebral palsy." In response to Heaven's death, Virginia passed Heaven's Law unanimously, requiring CPS workers to check for out-of-state reports made within 5 years of any Virginia report. Delegate Mike Mullins said, "I am of the firm belief that if this bill had been a law a year and a half ago, Heaven Watkins would still be alive." Sharonda said, "A lot of times you do feel alone, and to know somebody was listening and looking at her story, not just listening to me, but listening to heaven. That's the way I look at it." She also said, "People need to know Heaven's story. Heaven's not here, but Heaven's not going to die in vain. If we can help one other person, then we're going to help that one other person." Sharonda remains haunted, wondering what Heaven thought in those final months. If she wondered where her grandmother and aunt and cousin were. She worries that giving Heaven a taste of love and stability made her final years even harder. Because Heaven knew the difference. She knew what love was, what patience was, what having fun was. Sharonda said, "I knew it was going to happen, and I knew Heaven was going to be the one. I feel like the blood was on my hands too, because I'm trying to figure out what else I should have done." If she could talk to Heaven one more time, she would tell her she's sorry she couldn't do more, and that she really misses her.